The crystal glasses on the tables seemed to vibrate with the tension. My sister, Chloe, a woman who always had a perfect cutting response for everything, stood utterly silent. Her face, usually a mask of polished ambition, had crumbled into disbelief. Before her stood her boss, Mr. Sterling, a titan of an industry I secretly policed, and his voice was low, devoid of warmth. "Do you have any idea who you're talking about?" he asked. And in that moment, standing there in my wedding dress, I felt a strange and terrible calm settle over me. The reckoning had finally arrived. An hour earlier, I was just trying to feel like a bride. The reception was beautiful, simple. Everything I wanted. I was watching my husband, a kind history teacher who made me feel seen, laughing with his friends. Then I saw her approach, my older sister Chloe, a ruthlessly ambitious junior VP, who saw every family gathering as a networking event. And she was towing her boss, Mr. Sterling, a man whose entire world was built on a foundation of rules I helped write. "There she is," Chloe announced, her voice dripping with the patronizing sweetness she reserved for me. She gestured my way as if I were a quaint piece of decor. "Mr. Sterling, this is my little sister Anya. She has a quiet little data entry job with the government." She laughed, a sound like ice cubes clinking in an empty glass. "Bless her heart, she's got nothing going for her, but she seems happy." The words landed, each one a familiar stone added to a pile I'd been carrying my whole life. The dismissal of my career, the subtle jab at my husband, it was her entire worldview in a single condescending sentence. I just smiled, a placid expression I had perfected over decades. But inside, a cold fury began to burn. I watched Mr. Sterling. He wasn't smiling. His eyes, sharp and calculating, narrowed just slightly as he studied me. It was a micro-expression Chloe, in her desperate bid to perform, completely missed. She continued on, mocking my choice of a simple life, completely oblivious to the fact that she was standing before the two poles of her universe, the man who signed her paychecks, and the woman who could freeze his entire company's assets with a single directive. She saw me as a footnote in her grand story. A failure. A nobody. Chloe thought she was showcasing her own brilliance by painting me as the family failure. She had no idea she'd just mocked the one person whose signature can freeze billions of dollars of her firm's assets overnight. To understand the silence that was about to shatter my wedding reception, you have to understand the two lives I was living. To understand the woman standing in that wedding dress, you have to understand that for more than a decade, I had lived two completely separate lives. One was for my family, a carefully constructed fiction of a quiet, unassuming life. The other was the reality, a world of classified documents, immense responsibility, and consequences that were measured in billions of dollars and international stability. I kept them apart for a simple reason: to protect my work from their judgment, and to protect myself from their disappointment. But the walls I had built were beginning to feel less like a fortress and more like a cage. The memory that always surfaced when I thought of this duality was a family dinner from 6 months before the wedding. It was at a ridiculously expensive restaurant Chloe had chosen to celebrate her latest bonus. I sat next to my mother, Carol, a woman who believed family harmony was a pristine surface that should never be scratched by uncomfortable truths. Across from me was my father, a retired sales manager who saw the world, in terms of profit and loss, and in his ledger, I was a definitive loss. He beamed as Chloe, my sister, the family's golden child, detailed the absurd number of zeros on her bonus check. Then, with a flourish, she slid a crisp envelope across the table to me. Inside was a brochure for a starter investment portfolio, funded with what was, to her, pocket change. "I thought you could use a little help getting started, Anya," she'd said, her voice loud enough for the whole table to hear. "It's important to have, well, something to show for yourself." In that moment, I didn't just see the insulting pamphlet. I saw the community college classes I paid for myself while they funded her private university tuition. I saw the down payment on my sensible car that I saved for years to afford, while she was gifted a luxury sedan for graduation. I saw a lifetime of my quiet, steady progress being rendered invisible next to her loud, flashy achievements. Trying to deflect, I mentioned a complex data migration project I was managing at work, sticking to my cover story. My father gave me that familiar pitying smile and patted my hand. "That's nice, dear," he said, his voice gentle but dismissive. "It's good to keep busy. Just remember to leave the real financial wizardry to your sister." Chloe smirked, leaning back in her chair with a look of supreme satisfaction. She then turned to our mother and, in a stage whisper I was clearly meant to hear, said, "I worry about stagnant Anya sometimes." Stagnant Anya. Now contrast that noisy, suffocating restaurant with the silence of my real office. It's a place with no windows, reinforced walls, and technology that doesn't officially exist. We call it the SCIF. Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility. It's a sterile, silent world where the only thing that matters is the data on the screen and the credibility of your analysis. The people I answered to weren't my parents. They were senior officials from the Treasury, the State Department, and international banking regulators, their faces appearing on a heavily encrypted video feed. There was no small talk here. There were only stakes. Just a week after that dinner, I was the lead briefer on a critical finding. I stood at a podium in that silent room, my voice calm and steady as I laid out months of forensic accounting. We've traced the wire transfers through 3 shell corporations registered in Cyprus, which then funneled the capital through a holding company in the British Virgin Islands. I explained, my words precise. My analysis confirms these entities are being used to circumvent the sanctions placed on the Volkov syndicate. I am therefore recommending we issue a blocking notice under Executive Order 13,661. It will effectively freeze approximately $1.2 billion in assets across 3 continents. When I finished, there was no applause. There was no fawning praise. There was only a heavy, considered silence, broken by the voice of the Undersecretary of the Treasury himself. He looked directly into the camera, his expression unreadable but his respect palpable. "Proceed, Ms. Rostova," he said. "Your analysis has been flawless." That was it. Those 9 words, delivered in that silent room, were a validation more powerful than any bonus check Chloe could ever comprehend. It was a respect I had earned in the shadows, a world away from my family's blinding spotlight. This was the life I had to hide. My closest confidant in this world was my colleague, David, a brilliant analyst who was attending my wedding as my friend. A week before the ceremony, he had sent me a simple text. "You sure you want to invite the wolves to your big day?" He wrote. David was one of the few people who understood the full picture, the pressure of our work and the crushing weight of my family's ignorance. I remember typing back my response, a sense of resolve hardening in my chest. It's time the 2 worlds met. For years, I let them believe their story. It was a shield that protected my work. But when Chloe tried to use my wedding day to diminish me in front of her boss, I realized the shield had to come down. It was time for her to see what a data entry clerk really does. What happened at my wedding was not an accident. It wasn't a stroke of luck or a moment of spontaneous justice. It was a strategy set in motion months before I even picked out my dress. In my line of work, you learn very quickly that there are no coincidences. There are only variables, assets, and liabilities, and when my sister started bragging that her boss would be at my wedding, I knew a critical variable had just been placed on the board. For Chloe, bringing Mr. Sterling was a status symbol. For me, it was an opportunity I had no intention of wasting. I knew things Chloe didn't. I knew, for instance, that Mr. Sterling's bank had been peripherally involved in a recent sanctions inquiry my office had handled. His presence at my wedding wasn't just a social courtesy, it was a delicate political maneuver. He was a man navigating a world of immense power, and I understood that world far better than my sister ever would. His attendance wasn't a problem to be feared. It was a situation to be managed. So I began to plan my guest list not as a bride but as an analyst. Each invitation was a calculated move designed to create an environment where the truth was simply unavoidable. My friends from work were not just there to celebrate with me, they were there as quiet testaments to my real life. The most important invitation, however, was one I delivered myself over the phone. I called my direct superior, Director Marcus Evans, a man whose name carried immense weight in the financial and political circles of Washington, D.C. He was, to put it simply, an unimpeachable source of authority. His presence would be the quiet, undeniable fact that would dismantle my family's fiction about me. My friend David, my closest colleague, was my on-the-ground support. He understood the mission perfectly. He wasn't just there to be my best man. He was my tactical asset, tasked with a single subtle objective at some point during the reception. He was to gently steer Director Evans and Mr. Sterling into the same orbit. The goal was never a dramatic public confrontation. My plan was for a quiet correction, a simple handshake, a professional introduction that would force my family to reconcile their narrative of stagnant Anya with the reality of the woman standing before them. I intended to use a scalpel, but Chloe, in her bottomless arrogance, handed me a sledgehammer instead. Chloe saw my wedding guest list as a measure of my small life. She had no idea I'd arranged it like a strategic briefing. The key players were in the room. All it needed was a catalyst. And she was about to provide it. We returned to that moment, frozen in time at my wedding reception. The soft jazz quartet was playing, glasses were clinking, but a strange localized silence had fallen around my sister Chloe. She had just finished her little speech, her dismissal of my life delivered with a perfect patronizing smile. She stood there, holding her champagne flute like a trophy, waiting for her boss, Mr. Sterling, to chuckle along with her, to affirm her superiority. But he didn't. Instead, his gaze drifted past her, his focus sharpening on me, with an intensity that made the air feel thin. It was the look of a man solving a complex equation in his head, and I was the unexpected variable that made it all make sense. He took a single, deliberate step, and in doing so, he broke the spell. He moved not toward Chloe but around her, leaving her stranded in the middle of the floor with her arm still half extended in a gesture of dismissal towards me. It was as if a spotlight had been following him, and he had just dragged it across the room, leaving my sister in sudden, shocking darkness. Time seemed to slow down as he walked towards me. I saw my mother's brow furrow in confusion. I saw my father's smile falter. They were watching a powerful man, a man they admired, completely ignore their golden child and walk directly toward their invisible one. And they had no idea why. He stopped in front of my husband and me, extending a hand not to my husband, but to me. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, and his voice was completely different from the polite social tone he'd used with Chloe. This was the voice of business, of authority. "You're Anya Rostova, aren't you? The Anya Rostova from Treasury?" Hearing my full name, my professional name, spoken aloud in this place, was jarring. To my family, I was just Anya. To the world that mattered, the world I actually lived in, I was Anya Rostova. I took his hand. It was a firm, dry handshake. I gave him a calm, measured smile, the same one I used in high-stakes briefings. "Mr. Sterling," I replied, my voice even. "It's a pleasure to meet you outside of a sanctions advisory memo." A flicker of understanding, of shared language, passed between us. It was a sentence packed with subtext, a clear signal that I knew who he was, and more importantly, I knew that he should know who I was. It was a professional courtesy, and a warning. A short, sharp laugh of genuine respect erupted from him. It wasn't a social laugh, it was the sound of a man who appreciated a well-played move. Then, he turned his head slowly, deliberately, back toward my sister, who was now frozen in a state of growing dread. Her smile was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. Mr. Sterling's voice was no longer low, it was pitched to carry. "Project Chimera," he said, turning the words into a public proclamation. "Does that mean anything to you?" Chloe just stared, shaking her head mutely. The name meant nothing to her. It was a ghost. A phantom from a world she didn't know existed. That's when he dismantled her. "My dear," Mr. Sterling said, and the condescension in his voice was a perfect, brutal echo of the tone she had used with me moments before. "Your sister doesn't just have something going for her. Her name is on the directives that cost the Volkov Syndicate over $1 billion last quarter." A collective gasp rippled through the guests closest to us. He wasn't finished. "Every CEO on Wall Street knows her name. We study her analyses. We build compliance departments based on the policies she helps write." He took a step closer to Chloe, his voice dropping into a tone of cold, hard fact. Frankly, we're all a little terrified of her. He let that sink in. The silence in the room, now absolute. He then looked from Chloe's ashen face to my parents' bewildered one, and then back to her. So let me ask you again, he said, his voice like a gavel coming down. Do you have any idea who you're talking about? The aftermath was a vacuum of sound. Chloe's face was utterly drained of color, a canvas of pure, unadulterated horror. Her smugness, her lifelong armor, had not just been pierced, it had been vaporized. She was looking at me, at her quiet, unassuming little sister, as if I were a stranger she had just met, a terrifying creature she had completely and catastrophically misjudged. I glanced over at my parents. They were looking back and forth between us, their entire understanding of their own family, of their own daughters, crumbling into dust. I felt my husband's arm slide around my waist, a firm, proud anchor in the storm. Across the room I caught the eye of my colleague David. He slowly raised his glass, a silent, triumphant toast from one world to another. My sister had spent a lifetime defining me by her standards. In the end, it took one man, her boss, less than 30 seconds to completely erase her definition and replace it with the truth. In the moments after the truth detonated, the wedding reception rearranged itself around a new center of gravity. Me. The awkward silence slowly gave way to a muted buzz as guests, with a newfound awe and a touch of fear, tried to pretend they hadn't just witnessed a life being completely redefined. Mr. Sterling didn't leave. Instead, he spent the next 10 minutes speaking with me and my husband, his voice filled with an undisguised admiration, asking insightful questions about geopolitical financial trends. My own boss, Director Evans, joined us, clapping me warmly on the shoulder and telling, "My husband, you married one of the sharpest strategic minds in the entire department." I saw my family from the corner of my eye. They were an island of silent humiliation in a sea of celebration. Chloe stood motionless, her face a pale, empty mask. My parents looked small, lost, their entire belief system about their own children shattered beyond repair. They didn't try to approach me. They didn't say a word. About 15 minutes later, they simply vanished. They slipped out a side door, a quiet, undignified retreat from a world they had just discovered they knew nothing about. As I watched them go, I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel anger. For the first time in my entire life, when I thought about my family, I felt a profound and all-encompassing peace. I was finally free. I was surrounded by people who saw me. That night was not an ending, but a beginning. 1 year later, I stood in an office that was twice the size of my old one. It had a sweeping view of the Washington, D.C. skyline, a landscape of power and consequence. A simple, elegant plaque on the door read, "Anya Rostova, Section Chief, Special Investigations." It was a title I had earned, a legacy I had built in silence. I was at the head of a large conference table, concluding a briefing for my own hand-picked team of elite analysts. The large screen behind me was covered in the complex financial diagrams and network charts for our next major operation. "The shell corporations are a decoy," I explained, pointing to a weak link in the chain. "The real assets are being moved through the antiquities market. That's our point of entry." The faces looking back at me were sharp, focused, and filled with a respect I never had to ask for. The formal briefing ended, and the tense, professional atmosphere immediately softened into an easy camaraderie. This was my new family, a tribe I had built not on blood, but on competence and mutual trust. My deputy, David, came over and handed me a thick file with a single, ominous word on the cover. "Nightfall." He grinned. "The preliminary intel for Operation Nightfall is all there, Chief," he said. "Let's go make some billionaires nervous." I smiled back, a genuine, unburdened smile. We shared a purpose, a language. This was my world. This was where I belonged. Later that afternoon, back at my desk, an email notification popped up on my screen. The sender was Chloe. For a moment, I just looked at her name, feeling a strange detachment, like a historian reading a name from a long-forgotten past. The anxiety that her name used to trigger was gone, replaced by a quiet, clinical curiosity. The subject line was just 2 words, just, "Wow." I clicked it open. The first line read, "Anya, I know it's late, but I had to say I'm sorry. Mr. Sterling mentioned you in a board meeting today." My eyes scanned the next sentence. "He called you the ghost of Wall Street." A faint, sad smile touched my lips. A year ago, those words, the apology, the validation from her world, the cool nickname, would have been everything. I would have printed it out, held onto it as proof. But now? It was like a letter arriving at an address I no longer lived at. It was an answer to a question I was no longer asking. My validation wasn't a prize she could give me. I had already earned it. Without reading any further, I moved my cursor over the archive button and clicked. The email vanished. I took a sip of my cold coffee, picked up the Operation Nightfall file, and turned back to my work. My sister believed power was about being the loudest person in the room. I learned true authority is the silence that falls when you enter it. If you've ever had to build your own legacy while others refuse to see it, share your story below. In this community, your expertise is always recognized.